like I said, feel free to move around, grab some food still, but we will get started with the panel portion for tonight. And then, yeah, questions and captions will be projected on the screen and the slides for Zoom viewers as well. Okay, so just some opening notes before we begin. Our panelists here today do not single-handedly represent all of the neurodivergent community or the other groups that they identify and are a part of. So please take this discussion as a series of their lived experiences and their individual perspectives. Please maintain respect for all panelists and fellow guests. These are extremely vulnerable discussions, and it's our duty as a community to honor their time that they're spending with us and the emotional labor. So invasive or ill-intentioned conduct is not tolerated. So let's just keep it really fun, really kind and empathetic. We, of course, want to assume best intent, but just remember that impact is greater than sometimes the intent of what we say. Also, as individuals in a higher education space, this discussion lacks the perspective of people outside of this space due to systemic barriers. So we just want to acknowledge this gap, and please keep that in mind as we talk about perspectives today. All right, so this is the part that the audience can come in. So feel free to join at this poll EV link from any device. I'll leave this up just for a moment. And feel free to ask questions as they come up. If a panelist says anything that you'd love to learn more about, or if you just have any question about their identity, please feel free to put it in the poll EV. And you can also thumbs up questions from other people that you're interested in. And then we can also take raised hands in person as well for questions during the Q&A. So I'll just leave this up for a second.
Could you move the captions?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, how do
I just drag it up. Yeah,
this?
just the whole bar, yeah.
Oh.
It's very tall.
All right. Sorry for the caption issues. Okay.
If you're mirroring, you can drag that to the other screen so that it won't show you.
I don't think we're mirroring.
Yeah, we're not mirroring, sorry.
We tried.
Yeah, sorry. It's gonna look a little wonky, but all right. Is everyone in the room got the link if they're interested? Okay. All right. And just let me know if you need it again. Totally fine. All right, so let's get started. So our first question tonight for our panelists is, how does your community, whatever that means to you, view neurodiversity?
So we'll just go in this order. We won't be using a mic for obvious reasons. So my name is Kiara. I use any pronouns. I am officially diagnosed with ADHD, but who knows? So I will be speaking from a generally neurodivergent perspective. And in terms of community, for me, I belong to several different communities, but I guess one that is unique to me that I could talk about is being Indonesian. So my parents are from Indonesia, which is a country in Southeast Asia. And the problem, there are lots of problems regarding the cultural integration of neurodiversity. In some regards, Indonesia is more affirming in some ways, different forms of mental functioning are a bit more accepted and not as pathologized, but in other ways, certain aspects of neurodevelopmental disabilities can also be turned into a religious thing. So for me and my family, when my sister was having meltdowns and shutdowns and things like that, my parents interpreted it as a spiritual failing. So they literally tried to exorcise her. So that was a little bit of an experience for us. So I guess that's kind of how my community views neurodiversity. It's part of it is sometimes people are a bit more affirming. In some ways, they'll just say oh, people are just like that. That's just how they are. But in other regards, when, there are certain situations that neurodivergent people are stigmatized as not being religious or pious enough, and that's why they struggle with certain things. So that's kind of my take on that.
I'm Mara. I think I put myself as they, she for this. That's good enough for now. I self-diagnosed as autistic, self-identified as autistic, came out as autistic maybe 3 or 4 years ago at this point. after several coming outs and preceded by subsequent coming outs. The communities I'm a part of, like, we'll go like queer trans community, yeah. So like the queer community broadly, like, is sometimes very friendly to neurodivergence and sometimes just like not at all. And same with like the trans community is this like strange fragmented thing that's kind of a community sometimes and also not at all. But like the queer trans neurodivergent community is like phenomenal, right? So like I was at a Passover Seder yesterday and I pulled out like a little fidget guy to play with. And then like everyone else was like, oh my gosh, you have the same one. Like, let me tell you about all the things that I found to do with it that you didn't know to do with it. And there's just kind of like, I mean, in being with among like all queer trans neurodivergent folks, like there's just like ease where you can kind of like sit back and relax and not have to worry about masking or performing in a certain way. But that's a very unique space and that's certainly not shared by my experiences in like higher education, I'd say at all. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie. I identify as autistic, ADHD, and bipolar. So my community, interestingly enough, I basically like, I've had neurodivergent friends all my life. I basically at some point considered myself a magnet, and that's really true still now. All my close friends are autistic. All my extended friend network is neurodivergent. Like, and I kind of networked my way further and further and further into the neurodivergent and greater disabled community. Like, that's what I consider like my home community. I networked with people that turned out to be neurodivergent, and neurodivergent networked my way into, okay, shameless plug, shameless self-promotion, volunteering for Disability Rights Washington, interning for the Students Disability Commission, doing work with Huskies for Neurodiversity, and starting an RSO for neurodivergent and mad mentally ill students. So I got slowly more and more into the community until the community became all my sense of community. And it's viewed very positively by said community. People identify proudly as neurodivergent. Okay, I'm done.
So my name is May, pronouns are they, he. So I'm in many communities, as you can imagine. I'm Black, Native, trans, I'm also autistic with a whole other slew of different mental diagnoses, though I don't necessarily believe in pathologizing everything. Sometimes things are just part of the human experience. I'm also a librarian, and so I can speak a little bit to both the Black community, where something very similar happened to my cousin. Her extremely Christian Black family got her exercise for having depression and saying she didn't want to go outside. Pretty wild stuff like that. Well, at the same time, looking at the majority of people in my family and going, you eat the same food every day. You get angry when you hear noises that are a frequency you don't like, and you can't describe why. And I start kind of piecing these things together, but then it's always, no, you're autistic because of your dad. Wait a minute. So there's like a lot of denial, I would say. It's kind of viewed, at least in my experience, as like, no, that's not something Black people do. But I think Black people also end up masking a lot in different ways, just out of safety, especially the older generations. And so maybe showing these neurodivergent traits isn't as welcomed, just out of safety. Also, speaking as a librarian, like, so many of us are autistic, have ADHD, both more and it's really easy to recognize. I think it's kind of just part of what goes with being a librarian. So many of us are so good at hyperfixating that it's easy to go down a little rabbit hole for everything that we're doing. So that's also like, it's maybe in library sciences, being in the field, not as recognized, it's still starting to get recognized. But so many of us just kind of look at each other like, and we just kind of know. So those are two communities, I think, how we kind of view neurodivergence in my experience.
All right.
And we're gonna try a switch to just that one.
Hello. Okay. All right.
I think it's a little loud.
Too loud.
Like we can make it a little louder.
Sure, yeah.
Or do you wanna try this?
Not the same mics or
I think this sort of, yeah, I think people can hear us without the microphone, so I think.
all right.
Can you hear us on Zoom?
Can you talk in the microphone?
Hello.
We're trying to use the ceiling microphones in the room.
Yeah, I can hear them.
Do each of the panelists want to say something so we can make sure the ceiling mics will pick up your voices?
Sure. Tell me your favorite color. Blue.
The pink when the sun is setting, that's not quite pink, but kind of pink.
Purple, it represents spirit. I don't need a mic.
Hey, you're all good. Thank you.
At the end.
Yeah, or if you want to skip some of
Oh, what do you think?
your.
Okay. All right. Everything seems good now. All right. Thank you so much for sharing. I realized I didn't ask right away for an introduction, so I thank you for starting that. It's great. I'm so like happy that you're here, and I'm just really grateful for you. Like I said earlier, like giving your time and telling us about your story. So again, very appreciative. All right. I'm just gonna check and see if anyone has any questions. We can use this as a time if you'd like, based off their introductions and what they began talking about, if you'd like to ask any. And if not, we will return back to some of our previous questions that we've written. So I'll just give that a moment. And you're free if you're in the room as well to raise your hand if you have anything.
Know if the poll everywhere link is working. Like it says waiting for presentation to begin, but I'm happy to ask a question.
Okay, sure.
So I identify with the queer community, and I feel like one big thing is like pain is always like emphasized. So I'm just like curious, what's like something you enjoy about your identity or something that you've learned to love about yourself that's maybe been pushed down and told you that you shouldn't love yourself for having that quality, or kind of like what brings you joy about being the way you are, if that makes sense.
I can get us started. So I think emotional intensity, that's been a big one for me recently. I think that's kind of something that many people experience, you know, not everybody, some people experience less emotional intensity, but for me, I'm a very emotionally intense person. And I think when it's a low period, like when a little thing, especially like rejection sensitive dysphoria, when that hits, it's like terrible. It's like, oh my gosh, like why do I have to be like this? But on the other hand, when things are good, like right now is a pretty good time in my life, things are like really, really, really good. And I think this is something that I've talked about with people before, but just the idea that you experience emotions that most of the world's population doesn't experience, or you experience things in general that most of the world's population doesn't experience. And in some ways that can be, you know, bad, you know, there's sensory overload, there's just general overload, but in other ways, like engaging with your special or focused interests, or, you know, just feeling really passionate about a lot of things, like that passion is what kind of drives my entire life. And I really accredit that in large part to being neurodivergent. So I'd say that would be mine.
Yeah, I really identify with that. My nesting partner and I and our twice upstairs neighbor were like, we should have like a sad gay movie night. Like it'll be great. And then like we realized that like we could watch some of these movies forever and we could just continue to feel miserable. And I think we made it through like Brokeback Mountain and maybe like Carol. And like after the two of those, it was just like we gotta stop this. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think for me, like I'll echo the emotional intensity as well, that like this is also like perks of being grad school. I kind of like can kind of like mold my job to work for me mostly, and have the privilege of doing that. But like really just like enjoying being in like my own feelings and the feelings of others, and having that be like just wonderfully nourishing for me. And so that like that means that I can like hold space and hold capacity for others, and like do it over time in ways that like none of my colleagues can, or none of my colleagues have access to right now. And so that means that like there's this whole like class of good that I can do for the world that's just inaccessible for many people, and I find a lot of joy in that.
I forgot to introduce a couple of my identities that weren't neurodivergent. I identify as a demi woman and a demisexual, and also I'm a non-traditional student. I am a 28-year-old undergrad. As far as joy goes, finding out I was autistic kind of solved a lot of mysteries in my life. Like I always wondered, like, okay, why do I partially but not fully relate to femininity? Oh, it's because I have trouble like presenting as female due to sensory issues, and relating to other women, because finding like out neurodivergent women that aren't masked is so hard. And then the demisexual thing, like, okay, I think there's a logical progression. You do not go straight to romantic. We be friends first. And as far as joy goes, like, I've had a lot of false media scares just getting really into special interests due to having bipolar disorder. And I think with the autism thing, like just embracing and loving those special interests, and with knowing I'm bipolar for 5 years now, I know who to check in with, like, okay, do I seem manic or just really into something? And honestly, being more unapologetic about my special interests as time has gone on has really helped. I can just ramble about vernal procrastinations or freaking EDM, raving, candy. I'm really into that. Or autism itself, because I was suppressing my big special interest. I've always been fascinated with autism. Every time something related to autism comes up, good or bad, I have to comment on it. And oh, all my close friends are autistic, but I don't belong, so I'm going to exclude myself from that community. But then it was like, oh, you're autistic. Cool. Now I'm going to talk about it nonstop. Now I'm giving myself permission to enjoy that interest. Okay.
Does anyone else here, like, can you hear electricity? Like when the room is just, nothing's happening and you're like, what the fuck is that? So I'd say for me, like, I can hear electricity. No, plants make noise when they're like in pain or like dehydrated, and like animals can hear it. And like they just recorded it recently and were able to like synthesize that sound, but like I can't hear it, but I can feel the vibration of it. So if there's like a plant that's suffering, I'm like, oh my God, we have to do something. I cannot with this right now. Like, it's given me, embracing my neurodivergence and how much I feel, my capacity for feeling has given me so much more meaningful experiences in the natural world and just the world as a whole, that the structures of capitalism and grind culture really try to suppress. I really don't think that we're here to conquer nature in any way. I think we're just another animal and species as a part of it in our environments, and that there are other things that are just as important and bigger than us, not even just physically. And so being able to like hear plants, or like, oh God, there was mold in my sink once and it felt like it was screaming, like it was such a high pitched ringing. And I was like, oh, I can't, gotta get rid of it. But that's a very different noise from like a mold that could hurt me, even like audibly, versus like, I left my blender unclean for a little bit and yeast started growing. And I was like, hello, you little SCOBY, like, what's going on in there, you little fungi? It gives you a different way to interact with other pieces of the world. And it just makes me feel more connected with everything around me. And it makes other things around me feel happier that they're not being ignored.
Yeah, thank you for your great question. That was really cool to hear. Does anyone else in the room have anything they'd like to ask? I have the poll everywhere next to me, so I'm more than happy to read some of those in the meantime. All right. Oh, I'm sorry.
The woods then, is it really noisy?
Yeah, it's really noisy. I mean, I like that. I also used to live in Georgia, and like the nature there is so loud. Those cicadas just screaming. But I like the noise of the woods. If the woods are silent to me, it kind of tells me that it's not a place I'm supposed to be. And I just kind of listen to that and go, if other things aren't here, there's a reason. So maybe I shouldn't be here too, just in case there's something dangerous.
Okay. Our next question that we have, it's the highest rated one. Okay, sorry, I thought I saw a hand. So from your experience, would you recommend notifying your boss or a potential employer about your neurodivergence, and how do you go about it so that you don't miss out on a job, or that what you need comes across right?
Personally, I haven't, so I will defer to my other panelists.
This came up in a panel last Friday as well, that like it's autism's really tricky in that like so I'm out in lots of ways, like happy to be loud and proud trans, no big deal, right? Like wear that, right? And it's autism is the one I'm like careful about disclosing, because when I use that word, I'm going to trigger like a mound of stereotypes that the other person has about like, what does it mean to be autistic? What do I need being autistic? And like, you know, why aren't you a boy? And so like, I think I was doing a study on this, and someone gave the really helpful advice of like, think about like what you would want, like, what are you gaining? What do you seek to gain from disclosure? Right. And if there's like a tangible accommodation, that like great, right? Work with your employer to get the tangible accommodations if they're willing to do that. But like there's a limit on how much I will disclose to my boss, because there's only so much that she's going to understand. Okay. So like making clear asks is almost more helpful than coming out, at least for me. Like making clear asks is almost more helpful than like using the fancy diagnostic words, messy as they are, just to say like, hey, at some point during meetings, I'm going to get overstimmed and put in earplugs, and then maybe 5 minutes after that, I'm going to like hard out if I need to, and she can interpret what that means. Great. And we don't have to use the big fancy scary words that everyone else is afraid of. We can just sort of go with accommodations and go from there.
Last time I had a job, I knew about the ADHD and bipolar, but not the autism. And yeah, that's the one that's, well, bipolar is pretty stigmatized too. But I didn't really say anything, but like my coworkers knew. I talked about it openly. I don't know if it made it up to the boss level, It just didn't matter. As far as my future career, I want to do disability advocacy and community work. Especially, I'm going for stuff in the autism community or autistic community. The autism community is like autism moms. Autistic community is the right word. Very important. So hopefully disclosing will, be more of a benefit than anything else, because of having that lived experience perspective. Should my career goals go the way that I planned, I would love to disclose. I would love for it to be a safe space to disclose. I do not know what I'm going to do at all if I do not reach those goals. Either way.
So kind of following off of what Mara said, like I don't think that the language is necessarily that important as setting boundaries is, because of the things that Mara mentioned. Even if your boss, you can tell, oh, you're something, like I see something there. They might not be in a place where they're able to accept it and have their own biases, and that can still work against you. It's going to be different in different situations. I mean, with I wouldn't mention it in interviewing personally. I don't think I recommend that unless you're interviewing for a job where it's already known, like about the other people. Because autism also is such a broad spectrum. It's more of like a circle than it is a line. There's no like right way to support autism or someone who's autistic. So I think if it's accommodations that you need, going off of what Mara said of like, think about what it is you're trying to gain by sharing this. If it's accommodations you need, practice setting those boundaries. No, I have a hard stop here. No, the noise is too loud. It hurts my ears. I'm putting headphones in. I can still hear you. I'm going to talk to you, but I just have earplugs in. There's ways to kind of normalize it and assert yourself, which I know is hard for a lot of people, but being able to really assert that and say, make it seem normal because it is, but make them accept that it's normal in your need. I find to be a lot more effective than just asking for accommodations and like I'm autistic and I need autism accommodations way. That's really broad. So just being clear. Now coming out later at work, once you have that job and it's secured, that can be very different. I mean, my manager, I could very clearly tell, is like has ADHD. And when I was telling her like, oh yeah, I'm autistic, and she's like, oh, so's my partner. Like now we're in a space where we can kind of share and build a more intimate relationship at work. That's still an appropriate one regarding neurodivergency. But in the interviewing process, I wouldn't bring that up. I think there's a lot of biases that can work against you, and that's unfortunate. And it's also a reality that I want to like emphasize can work against you.
This is Tiara speaking. I have a more insightful response now that I've heard everyone talk. I'd say sometimes, like what May was saying with setting boundaries, I feel like just doing things sometimes can be good. Of course, it depends on the job, but I'll just give you my perspective. I have ADHD and I work in a laboratory. Those two things don't really go together very well. You have to be very precise and you have to know exactly what's happening and you have to manage your time super well. And those are things that I had to learn like on the job. But some things I just started doing for myself. And then I'm very fortunate to have a very understanding boss. But like during meetings, for example, I'll always write down all of my notes because otherwise I will forget. And sometimes I'm a lot better writing things down than I am talking. And my boss thinks that's great because it's like, oh, all the details are on the Google Drive. And it's like, yep, that's why I'm doing that. It's to make your life easier and not because I physically have difficulties with that. So I think being a little bit creative in terms of figuring out what your own needs are and accommodating yourself sometimes. I'm very fortunate to be in an environment that accommodates that as well. And I must say research labs are very neurodivergent coded, but sometimes just like taking the plunge and then seeing how if somebody else doesn't recognize the strengths of that approach of like writing everything down, then sometimes like bringing it up yourself, like, hey, I'm writing this down so that, you know, everyone remembers whatever, that can be helpful too.
I would just add and say, like, it should be okay to be out at work, like full stop, right? Like, we should have bosses and managers and people and communities where like being out at work is something that's celebrated and something that's gorgeous, right? And like from what Katie was saying, like this is like what I'm the intent of trying to take my job of like, let me go somewhere where I can like be very happily out at work and not have to worry about that, and like be able to do that. I mean, like the folks that helped me realize that I was autistic were like loud and proud at work, right? And like I have so much admiration for them, and like the risks that involves, and so like something I've like am working towards in the spaces that I'm in is like, okay, like it's both complicated being out professionally, but also it's like it's really, really necessary because, you know, the communities of folks that you're in like desperately need you to be as fully you as you are, and everyone seeks to benefit from that, and it should all be gorgeous and wonderful and okay, and hopefully you can find spaces that are that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Just as an update for everyone in the room, if the poll everywhere didn't work for you before, it is working now. So feel free if you have anything that continues to come up during our conversation. So next, based on a question from the Zoom, what would you recommend for someone who's just beginning their diagnostic journey and is still trying to figure out what neurodiversity means for them?
That's a good question. I think it'd be helpful to first talk about my experience. So I was diagnosed like literally last year, when like pretty much the month after I turned 18 was when I got diagnosed. But I was an early entrance student to UW, so I was in my senior year. So basically like no time to get accommodations or anything like that. And I think first off, the first thing before you even start is to know that you don't, it's good to think about a diagnosis not just as a validation, like a professional validation of who you are, but rather something, it's more so a tool. So if you feel like a diagnosis will open doors to accommodations or medication, I know that's a big one for ADHD, then by all means, like go ahead and do it. But if you're looking for a diagnosis just to validate to yourself that like, oh yes, I am really, I do really have ADHD, or I am really autistic, but you know, it might not be helpful in other ways, then you know, you don't need to be diagnosed to consider yourself like valid as a neurodivergent person, because it's a very expensive and it's a very long process. And for me, at the end of my diagnosis, they said like, we don't really, like you're definitely neurodivergent, but we don't really know what's going on. So we'll just say you have ADHD so you can get medication and try that out. But good luck, that'll be $3,000. Please pay that by next month. So, you know, the institutions we are within are very outdated. And that's not just something, that's not like a political point either. That's just facts, like just evidence-based. The first person who is diagnosed with autism is still alive. So everything is still very new. Everything is still progressing. And don't let anybody tell you that just because you don't have a $3,000 piece of paper that says, I'm diagnosed with this, that you're not valid in your identity. But if it would be helpful for accommodations, then by all means, go ahead and seek out whatever you need. And it can be very helpful in that way.
Who was the first person diagnosed with autism? What?
Autism, Andy. I don't know. I don't know his name, but I do know that he's alive.
Like, when was this?
I think,
54?
yeah, I'm not sure, but it's very new.
40s,
Yeah.
He's 89 years old.
Bro. So it's not even 100 yet.
What's his name?
Donald Gray triplet.
Triplet.
All that Donald. Yeah. So like, this is Mara speaking, to echo a lot of what was said. Like, so I will point folks towards Devin Price wrote a gorgeous book called Unmasking Autism. It is, I think, maybe one of 3 resources I found that like doesn't make me angry reading it, right? And so like would highly recommend, you know, go read it. It's great. he has a blog post that's like why you should maybe reconsider trying to get an autism diagnosis. There's lots of ways that having a diagnosis can cause more harm. It can lead to discrimination. It can lead you to like being barred from leaving the country, being barred from citizenship, and like a long list of things that like kind of get more challenging, right? And I would also voice that like the diagnostic tools that we have are at best outdated. They're very sexist, they're really racist, and most of whether you get a diagnosis or not is whether you fit the diagnostic purveyor's conception of what ADHD looks like or what autism looks like, right? So like if you fit their conceptions, great, like you'll get the fancy piece of paper, you'll spend a lot of money doing it. And if you don't, then like I have friends and folks I hold near kind of going through this process now. Like it's, for one friend in particular, like it's kind of an abusive process of like really trying to claim yourself and your identity in spite of what the medical establishment says about you. So I'm like, and then also like the only cure for autism, and like that's a whole messy thing, is ABA, and it causes PTSD in half the folks it purports to treat. So like maybe like that is that whole space. Let's just name that. My usual advice for folks learning about what neurodivergence is to look at memes, right? Like memes are freaking great, and like you can go like read the fancy books, right? Like Devin Price is great. You can go like read the fancy papers. If you're like me, you can go down the Google Scholar rabbit holes and start reading papers that have just been published. Or like you can just go look at memes and say like do these memes fit me or do these memes not fit me? And there's like a lovely study that was like identifying with memes about autism actually predicts autism, right? And so like you can like take that for yourself or not. It's like not a one and done. But yeah, like go look at memes, go find community with folks that are near you, and just like go look at memes. That's the best advice I have.
I need to clarify that I am actually currently self-diagnosed. Self-diagnosis is widely accepted by the neurodivergent community, including organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Autistic Women's and Non-Binary Network, and Square Pegs, which is a local autistic group in Seattle, Washington. I highly recommend checking them out. They're great. I was already really deep in the neurodivergent community when I started figuring this out. So I didn't really have to look very far. Like my closest friends, like, oh yeah, we don't doubt it. Nobody really doubted it except for my parents. I actually gave my mom the book Unmasking Autism after I finished reading it. Highly recommend. I second Mara. It helped her self-diagnose. So I do have an autistic parent. But I am under pressure from my other parent to undergo the official diagnosis process so I can get SSI. And I'm really not looking forward to it because I have really, even before I figured out the autism thing, I had really strong opinions. Only autistic people should be doing research on autism. They have an inside perspective. Hell, only autistic psychologists should be diagnosing this shit. Like they have the insider perspective. A lot of the diagnostic criteria looks at what the impact of the autistic person is on neurotypical people. It looks at what's on the outside. But the truth is there's a lot of internal shit that only you think you experience, when in reality, so many other people experience. And part of my road to the self-diagnosis process was really just engaging with lived experiences of the community. Being a good anthropologist, I'm a medical anthropology major. So one of my first things on Reddit actually was, am I too overexpressive and extroverted to be autistic? And basically everybody's like, oh yeah, difficulty controlling the volume of your voice, having super exaggerated facial expressions. Those are all signs. And I don't know why I thought that one couldn't be autistic and extroverted. My first friend at UW is more extroverted and louder than me. And he's been diagnosed since he was like 7 or 8.
I think it is hard sometimes when you see a lot of people who are diagnosed as children and you do more research. It's hard to get diagnosed as an adult. It also brings into the question, who is diagnosis for? Is the diagnosis for you, or is it serving a purpose for people to know how to categorize you? As Mara said, there's detriments to having that diagnosis too. My wife is someone who was diagnosed as a kid. When she had COVID and was in the hospital, having trouble breathing, she was able to get out before it happened because someone reminded her, you're diagnosed autistic, and if you need any sort of ventilator or life support, they can pull the plug on you. They don't have to treat you in Michigan if you're autistic. That's eugenics. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. That's eugenics. So it does also open you up to some additional medical trauma and medical abuse within a system that already isn't designed for so many people. So it does bring, again, who is the diagnosis for? Is it for you? You'll hear from most, I would say, autistic people that self-diagnosis is totally acceptable. It's totally valid. Because in the end of the day, does spending $3,000 on a test and having a piece of paper, ICD-10 code that follows through your hospital stays help? Or is it that you want to understand more about yourself? Because this is just one framework for doing it. Self-diagnosis can open you to so much. I would say if you're exploring your neurodiversity, talk to other neurodiverse people. You might also realize that all of the people around you are maybe autistic, that they all have ADHD. You'll start those patterns. Pattern recognition is such a big part of having autism too, of being autistic. And you'll start, in my experience, I look at the different pieces where I do need accommodations, but I don't see autism as a disease. And for me personally, and I'm only speaking on my own experience, I don't see it as a disability for me, just because the system is meant to purposely punish people like me. It's not my fault that the system makes it difficult to work 40 hours a week. Fuck, we're not supposed to be working 40 hours a week. We really should be working much less. We really don't need to work that much. It causes so much burnout. It's not good for our health in so many ways. I don't see not being able to keep up with that as a disability. I see it as a system that's not broken, but designed to hurt people anyways. So there's also a kind of different framing regarding how you interact with the world, what things are set up to hurt you, and what accommodations can you get, what accommodations do you need in order to still survive in this capitalist hellscape.
No one can say who you are but you.
I have one final comment. It's actually really, really common for neurodivergent people to intentionally or unintentionally cluster around socially. This can be explained by the double empathy problem, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to info dump on it. Y'all can look it up. It has to do with understanding perspectives.
Right, this may kind of covered it, but there's another question. So do you identify as disabled if you feel comfortable sharing, of course? And how do you feel about neurodivergence in the disabled community?
So I would say, especially after steeping myself in the disability justice community a little bit more at UW. I would say I am disabled, and I identify as disabled, and I would say that so basically there's the social model of disability and the medical model of disability. And the mainstream model is the medical model, which suggests that disabilities, physical and mental, are located within the individual, and that's their problem, and that's that. Whereas the social model suggests that, yes, you're built differently, but also the world around you isn't built in a way that accommodates you. And I'd say, for me, it's definitely at the intersection of those two things. The way my brain is built makes it very difficult to clean clothes off my floor. So, there will be clean clothes on the floor at all times. And that annoys me a little bit, but that's just kind of how it is. But there are also a lot of societal barriers that make it so that I am disabled. Not just disabled as in me as a person, I am disabled, but disabled as an active verb. The world disables me in the way that it's structured and the way that people handle things. And I think the way this shows up for me most is socially. There's a mainstream form of communication that's kind of like a rule book that everyone seems to just understand. And neurodivergent people aren't left out of that just because, oh, your brain doesn't understand social cues, or you don't do this way. Because if you are neurodivergent and you meet other neurodivergent people, you'll probably find that it's a lot easier to interact. It's just that our culture and the mainstream society doesn't accommodate those differences. And I think the biggest thing is that they don't give benefit of the doubt. If you're not looking into somebody's eyes, or you might not pick up on things, or you want things more directly, the problem is that people will just assume that that's some kind of personal moral failing, instead of thinking, okay, maybe there's some reason they're doing that. And I think that's just a constant struggle, especially in an individualist society where it's your behavior is because of you and it's not influenced by anyone else, whereas I feel like it's a little bit more complicated than that. So yes, I am disabled, but in two different ways. I'm disabled myself, but also the world is disabling.
Yeah, I like the dis-abled or the dis/abled. This is also this is Mara speaking, being in the academic spheres, we love the slashing words and the this word and this word and this word hyphen this word. It's very and it's good to have there's something very nourishing to me about actively sitting in the multiplicity of language like that. And that's really wonderful. I think there's other studies about how quickly holistic or neurotypical folks will find ways to make judgments about neurodivergent people, and on the order of tens of milliseconds, right? Someone can tell, right, that something's off, right? And I think the tough bit for me is more about it's in part we can go medical model and social model, but it's also the burden of responsibility in bridging a gulf of communication is almost always entirely on the neurodivergent person. So when I'm conferencing or academicing or whatever, I need to don the mask or bend myself in shape so that I come across as Mara, PhD, whatever, right? And I would love that, even if it's just I would take a 50-50 split, I would take an equitable split would be gorgeous, right? A justice-centered split would be even better, right? But especially I think with family members after coming out and sort of letting go of the ways that I've masked a little bit, I've use the line just treat me like an alien, it'll be easier, right? Treat me like someone that you have no conceptions about, that you are actively working to bridge this gap and actively working to communicate. And of course that doesn't go well when you say it to your parents, but so I wouldn't recommend that language specifically, but the words feel okay. And again, mostly just who is the burden of responsibility on for accommodating.
I like what Mara said, and I'm going to second it, the dis/abled, because on one hand, with all my neurodivergency, my executive function can be garbage. Messy room, having trouble starting and stopping tasks, unless I'm really, really interested in something. But I don't know why I can't come up with more examples. Oh, some of the stuff that comes out of my mouth when I don't know what to say in the moment has been really questionable. I have gotten a hard time for it. I have gotten in trouble at work for it. I have pissed people off. But yeah, I've always been crap at masking. So the disability does come out. But on the abled side, there is a lot that I can do that other people don't. Not surprisingly, before I figured out the autism thing, I did a few papers on neurodivergency. And I kicked those projects' asses. After I figured it out, I did a paper on queerness in the autistic community. Kicked its ass. And for the summer quarter, I'm doing, here, let me just plug all my academic stuff. I'm doing my disability studies capstone on history of the neurodiversity movement, which did start with autistic people and then became more inclusive, and treatment of autistic people in the workplace, which there are a lot of scholarly sources on. And I'm going to kick those projects' asses because it's my special interest. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, both a disability and a strong ability.
So I am disabled. So I have EDS. I have some inflammatory issues as well. And then I have long COVID as well. And so that's definitely hampered my physical abilities. But I've also experienced, disability is dynamic. So I've had depression that has just been like fine. I've also had debilitating depression where I could not do anything and it was actively hurting me. And so I think there are some boundaries and some nuances to it as well. Like Tiara talking about Tiara or Tiara?
Either one's fine.
Okay. What do you have a preference?
I'm good.
Okay. I'm gonna use both because now I don't know which one. So like Tiara was saying, like sometimes what are your pronouns again?
I don't care.
Okay. I also forgot to say, this is May speaking. I figured like if you just hear the last voice, it's mine. I'm at the end of the table. Anyways, I got so off topic. So what Tiara was saying about clothes on the floor, like, I mean, there's like, it's just clothes on the floor. Like, I mean, it might be different if you have like ants in your house and they're getting into your clothes. That's a different situation. Maybe you don't want your clothes on the floor, and actively having them on the floor is like becoming a problem for you and like feeling like you can put clothes on without ants crawling in them. But if they're just like on the floor, like, is that hurting you? Is that really something that like needs to be addressed, or are there more important things you can be focusing your time on that matter more for you?
That's what I've been telling my mom.
And so much that comes down to like talking to our parents and being like, the dishes aren't done doesn't mean I'm lazy. It doesn't mean that anything is wrong, but I left this thing in the sink too long and now there's blue mold and it's screaming. So it's like there are things that don't need to be addressed. There are things that do need to be addressed, and it's being flexible and understanding that these situations are flexible. They're not good or bad. They just need to be addressed or don't need to be addressed. And so I now make some different habits where I'm like, okay, I make sure that dishes aren't sitting on the table for more than 3 days. I also make sure I try to get as much food out of it as I can, and I don't have things stacked on top of each other where mold can grow. Like, I might not be able to just get to the dishes, and that's okay. So considering some different ways to like be flexible and give myself grace, because it's dishes, like it's not that big of a deal. But also being able to like ask for help when I need it. Another thing that Tiara said of like, not everything is accessible for us in this world. This world isn't built for us. It's hyper individualistic. We're not supposed to do everything by ourselves. Like I, after this, have to go pack for a trip that I'm going on tomorrow. But I also need to buy food for my wife because she's disabled and she can't cook when I'm not around. We also don't have pans right now. So that's also like a big barrier. But I was getting so stressed out thinking about it. And I just asked my friend that lives next to the store, hey, could you pick these things up? I'll cash app you and can you drop them off to my wife? And she's like, yeah, of course. Like that's such like having community and friends that can be there for you. They don't even have to be your friends. They just have to be people that you have some relationship to where you can ask, make these kinds of asks. So I think a lot of disability discourse surrounding neurodivergence, the answer is something that I would hate being told this answer like right off the bat, but it depends. Like there are varying degrees, and there's also varying degrees of like, one, not everything is your fault, but also there's some things that we have to be responsible for, because in this world, sometimes the only person that can be there in that moment for us is ourselves. And so how do you learn to care for yourself? How do you learn to be in a community and open yourself to receive care from other people? Because sometimes we don't have to be completely alone. There's other people that are around us too. And how do we take accountability for things that are, you know, something that needs to be addressed versus something that doesn't need to be addressed? It's not putting it into a good or bad, positive or negative category. It's just, does this actually need to be a thing or is it fine?
I just wanted to add on to that as, this is Tiara speaking. I just wanted to add on to that, that a lot of times when we talk about, you know, what is disability? Do you consider yourself disabled? Is this label a disability? That kind of thing. People often say, okay, but what about people who have higher support needs? Or what about people who can't live alone full time? And I'd say like May's point about interdependence, so depending on other people, I think the whole reason that disability is viewed as a burden to begin with, or as something that's a burden on people, on families, like a financial burden, et cetera, is because society is built that way. It wouldn't be a financial burden if we were built in a more community-oriented fashion. And this is something that, you know, you can only really learn in disability studies classes. Like throughout my whole time at UW, until I took a disability studies class, I never even considered this, but you know, the way we structure our society, at least in the US, at least in the communities that I've been in, you know, you have your nuclear family and your two parents are supposed to take, two or one parent is supposed to take care of everything. And you know, it all falls on them, but that's not how human communities have been structured historically, you know, like, and people who have higher support needs, people who need like full-time care or whatever, if society was structured differently, they would be accommodated in a better way. It's just because the way we've organized like the family unit and the societal unit and the social unit, that's what's created a financial cost to disability and made it into the thing that it is now. And I'd also want to recognize that we might be missing, and we are missing the voices of people who do have higher support needs, who people who couldn't make it into higher education because of the barriers we put up. But if you're wondering about their thoughts, you'll need to ask them. So we can't speak on those people's behalves, I guess. But I guess I just wanted to bring up that point because I know that comes up a lot.
Yeah, this is like the poly classic of like, why would you ever try to have children with only two parents? That seems absurd. Like two people, like, and so like there's some lovely like narratives in the poly community that like 3-to-1 is a good ratio, right? 4-to-1 is even better, right? And like, so this isn't like necessarily something that's unique to neurodivergence or disability specifically. Like this is like the poison that we all share is kind of being burdened with like only having ourselves to look out for ourselves rather than having like communities and networks of support where like you can lean on friends and family and colleagues and like and kind of have a guarantee that someone will have space to show up, right? Like when your community is large enough, someone will always have space to show up. We're just kind of trying to do the 2-parent thing forever until Totally kills us.
Yeah, and you don't even need to look into history to see how families have been structured differently in different cultures as well. Like Indonesia has significantly fewer resources for people with disabilities. I don't even know like what the social security network looks like, but like as my parents were talking about the future for my sister, who struggles a bit more with the school system and everything, they're like, you know, maybe she would have been better off in Indonesia because your whole community cares for you. There's always somebody ringing your bell and trying to see if you need anything. And you know, it gets complicated when you think about emotional labor, like what should be compensated financially, what should be compensated in a more, I guess, holistic sense. But, you know, I think it's just important to consider that as well. Like culturally, it's different. And if you go to a different part of the world, disability looks different as well.
And being reciprocal in those settings. I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, I can't do the exact same thing for them. That's not like what they're asking for. And also if there's anyone that like has studied like any other spiritual religious traditions where they might give offerings to spirits, they're not asking for money. They're asking for their favorite foods. They're asking for a game. Like it's not about money. It's about joy and things that make us feel more like ourselves, things that help us experience the world better. And so like my wife is disabled. She's on disability. She's, you know, on a fixed limited income, but the things that she can give back to her community because she loves and cares for the people that love and care for her often comes in the form of beautiful art. So just helpful suggestions here and there. Like there's ways to engage and have this kind of community building that's not built on a transaction. It's built on love and care for each other and doing something because you also want them to, you want to show your appreciation and gratitude, and it doesn't have to be doing the exact same thing they did for you.
Thank you. So this is a question for you, Maggie. Feel free to answer at your comfort. So how do you feel being Black has affected your neurodiversity and how you mask in multiple ways?
So I think I mentioned this earlier. I think Black people mask a lot. I think we end up having to mask in white institutions. I think we end up having to mask just when we're out so that we don't get looks, we don't draw attention. And something that a teacher in my community said was like, she said that she thinks a lot of Black families are very socially conservative, not like in a Republican sense, but in a, no, we don't express this, we don't express that. That's gonna draw attention to you. And there's also, you know, historical reasons that I'm not gonna get into that tie to that tie to our need for survival. There's the fact that Black autistic people are more likely to be killed by the police and by medical practitioners. These are realities that fucking suck, but they're also realities that we can't shy away from. Side tangent that's tying into what I'm gonna say. So I had this wonderful opportunity yesterday to interview Elmer Dixon, the lieutenant of the Seattle Black chapter, Black Panthers chapter in the 60s and 70s for a project I'm doing in my master's. And something he said that really stuck with me was his parents, you know, he was born in the 50s and his parents were like, you don't shy away from this, but don't you let what's happening keep you from having hope. You let that anger fuel you so you can have hope. And so these things fucking suck that we have to deal with it, but I am not gonna let it keep me from experiencing joy. My right that I am entitled to as a human on this earth is my joy. It is to be part of this nature. It's to be part of this world. It's not to impress anybody in this institution, in this country. And I have no one to answer to but myself, my ancestors, and God. So when it comes down to it being neurodivergent, I don't have a problem expressing myself and being true to myself because so many people in my history and my lineage did not have that opportunity and that right. And who am I going to be to deny myself that when I could be living for myself, living embodied in my own liberation? So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate your vulnerability and talking about it. And like, it's really important to hear this perspective, especially as we remember we are in a predominantly white institution. So I, again, just thank you so much for answering that. I really appreciate that. All right. Next question. What is one of the biggest unwritten social rules that you discovered later in your life?
Oh, can you repeat it? I didn't hear that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. What is the biggest unwritten social rule that you discovered later in your life?
Oh, that's a good question. Maybe I'll have to think on that. Maybe I'll listen to everybody else first. And you can, and then I'll try.
So I proposed my thesis, which is a general's exam in the PhD land, about a month ago, and that had part of it like a very pretty vulnerable story, and I think that was like my way of trying to be plain. Like, there's a limit on how vulnerable the world expects you to be. Like, and even more than that, there is a capacity of hurt that you can expect others to witness, and beyond that, you should keep that hidden. You should keep that to yourself, right? And so, like, a lot of my life, and especially a lot of my childhood, was like not being sure, like, what that boundary was, right? Like, how much of myself am I allowed to share before I'm too much, right? And how much of, and this was also like, I was like socialized AMAB, and so like, yes, there's lots of gender confounds there, and like we should totally talk about them. But like, yeah, but like learning like what is personal and what is professional, something I'm still working on, right? And like still bumbling through a mess of. And my advisor and I have talks, I think about monthly at this point, about like, okay, like, Amy, where exactly is the professional line of this space, and like, and how many times have I crossed it this one? Because like, and like, I mean, for me, like, I try to hold a lot of grace with it. Like, I have the community that like is ready to go into Feelingsville, like at the drop of a hat, and like I love them and I'm here for them. And I also recognize that like that as a performance of self is not amenable to the institutions that I exist within. And so this is like, well, let me not like learn to mask. Let me learn to like play the game selectively so I can not play it when I'm with the people that I love. Right? And like learn to do both to the degree that I can.
I second a lot of what Mara said. Socially, I have trouble gauging closeness with people. So sometimes I'll like way overshare and people are like, what the hell? Or I'll just share too much of myself. I'm really like naturally open about like everything ever. So I have trouble understanding where the line is. I've learned to ask people where the line is, but that was not always historically the case. Yeah, or talking about something too much, repeating myself as we do, or as I do, speaking for myself. It's hard because then you have to kind of shut yourself down and act in an unnatural way. And I guess my masking is sort of shutting down and being hyper cautious. Like, okay, don't say this much, don't talk about this, don't talk about that. Is this person a close friend? Are they just an acquaintance? Like, I just don't know a lot of the time. So I've gotten, I don't want to say better and better. I guess I do better and better at closing myself off unfortunately, because of how much shit I've gotten for oversharing.
I think something that I've learned a lot is to not, I saw this in a TikTok, this person who said she was having trouble being friends with people who had really firm boundaries at first. Because she didn't understand, she was misreading it as a selfishness, not understanding that it was actually herself that she has been taught and socialized to extend and push her boundaries no matter what for other people, for the sake of someone else's comfort. And so when someone won't do that for her, she realized it's not fair of me to ask them to do the exact same thing that I hate doing for me. And that's also something that I've learned of, like, I do so many things. I've worked on this that I didn't really want to do, but I desired that closeness with someone, and I thought that was the way to be close to them. And it's like, you know, sometimes you do it just because it's, personally, I hate Marvel movies. Personal opinion. I cannot stay awake during them. I hate US military propaganda, and that's all I see a lot of times. No shade to anyone who enjoys them. One of my bandmates really wanted to see Infinity War, and he was about to go off to college, and I was like, well, yeah, I'm gonna go sit through this movie I don't want to go to because I want to spend time with him before he goes. And this is literally the only time I have. But that's a lot different than in that situation with that constraint and that context than him being like, hey, you want to go see It Chapter 2? And I was like, no, I really don't. I'm not gonna make myself suffer through 3 hours of a CGI clown. Oh, the more I sit there, I'm gonna feel like I'm the clown. So for my sake, I'm gonna say no. And that isn't something, especially like growing up, I didn't have a lot of friends because I was in an online school. Because my mom refused to put me in school. She used to work for the school system. I was like, oh, hell no, you're not going there. So I went to an online school, but I also didn't have a lot of friends. And so I was ready to always push and fold my boundaries to make space for other people, for the chance that maybe they'll make space for me in the future. And I also met a lot of people that did that too, who didn't have the same circumstances growing up that I did, but they were taught that they needed to bend themselves, make themselves smaller for other people. And so now being in a position where I'm setting boundaries to not do things to make people comfortable, to do things like get up in the middle of the panel to go to the bathroom or go get the last ginger peach water because it tastes good and I don't want to drink the water from my water bottle. If my mom were here, she'd be like, you're being so rude by standing up. You're being so rude by interrupting, but that's not it. Like, who am I hurting? Maybe someone gets distracted, but like, I'm getting my ginger peach sparkling water. So it doesn't really matter to me. And I'm not hurting anyone. So being more comfortable with like breaking these rules and recognizing some of these rules are meant to put us in positions where we don't prioritize ourselves because it doesn't give others who are in other positions of power that material power over you.
Ditto to everything, especially talking about not making yourself palatable. Like, I feel like people.
That's a good word.
Yeah, like people talk about, like exactly. It's like people are like, oh, when I was this age, I didn't care about anything, and now I'm so stressed and anxious. And for me, there was never really an age. I feel like ever since I was potty trained, I was so embarrassed. But it took one day to potty train. My whole life is determined by shame. Yeah. So I think learning how to stop doing that has been something that I've had to unlearn. And I think we're coming up towards the end of the panel, so I guess I will end on 3 anecdotes and then 1 final message from that. So just so everybody can, I guess, feel better about themselves with their social obliviousness. I'm just really oblivious sometimes. Like I'll pay attention to some details and I'll completely neglect others. I accidentally went on a date when I was like 13. And we went to his house and I thought we were just friends. So I was like, we should take pictures of like a bunch of pillows between us so we can send it to all of our friends to be like, hey, we're just watching a movie as friends. And I only recognized that it was a date afterwards when I saw the smile fade from his face. So that was one thing. I didn't realize my boss and my coworker were married to each other. They literally Zoomed from their same house that they share because they're married to each other. But I was like, wow, my coworker must be so dedicated coming into my boss's house just to work. So it's like there's no excuse for that, to be honest. But that's like how oblivious I can be sometimes. And let me think. Oh yes, and then like black and white social boundaries. Any gray zone. I never gradually become friends with somebody. Like we just share everything about ourselves the first day. And this is this case for like every single one of my close friends. And then I have some acquaintances that I'll talk to occasionally. But most of the time I forget they exist, not because I don't love them and appreciate them, just because my brain cannot compute the boundary between different friendships. And thinking about what is okay to share with an acquaintance is too much stress and work for me. So I just don't think about it. And the way this manifested in middle school was that I would form cults. I formed 2 cults. One was a dolphin cult. I had everyone sign a piece of paper saying they paid allegiance to dolphins. There were like 34 signatures. That was my social credit or my social acumen at the time. And I was like, yeah, this is proof that I'm not weird. It's not. And then the second year, so in 8th grade, I formed a cult around a person, one of the upperclassmen. Fortunately, he was okay with it, but that was really weird. So it's like, if you feel bad about that, don't. There are other people that are probably weirder than you. And the final thing, just like, we're all weird. It's okay. And I feel like normal people are also weird. The more I've talked to quote unquote normal or neurotypical people, they all have weirdness. They just try really hard to pretend to be normal. And you don't need to do that. Like, especially as I've started to like actually put myself out there. Usually I let people come to me, but now that I've been like, I want to cultivate relationships and friendships before I'm an adult and everything is terrifying and awful. And it's like, you know, I can try to pretend to be normal, but at this point now it's just like, I give them bait to show how strange I am. And if they don't take it, who cares? Why would I want to talk to that person anyway? So it's like, you know, this is, if anyone's seen that meme that's like, people will complain at Subway that their sandwich isn't good. You made the sandwich. You make the sandwich. Like you determine who your circle is and how you carry yourself. And, you know, it's so cheesy because everyone's like, be yourself. And, you know, when you are yourself, a lot of the times people will not like that, but sometimes they will. So just like take a chance, find people that you can be around and build a community. And, you know, and like I started Huskies for Neurodiversity to do that and like to see everybody here and like, you know, listening to all of us blabber, it's like, this is great. And this is a place that people are. And this is a space that, you know, we've cultivated. Nobody made this space for us. UW didn't say, let's start a neurodivergent student club. They barely make disability resources for students in general. Like the capacity they have is not enough. So sometimes you just need to make it yourself and like push ahead if you have this capacity and time and whatnot, but you can do it. You can make it yourself. You can DIY your way through your social world and all of your everything. So that's the biggest thing I've learned, I think.
The union person in me is like, huh, the UW wouldn't do it anyways. UW works because we do. Like,
Exactly. Yeah. You contribute more than you think all the time. Just like sitting somewhere or being there for somebody or being present anywhere you are. That's your cute contribution, and you don't need to do or be anything more than that.
All right, very well said. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your questions. Just to respect everyone's time, it is 7:35. So that is the official end of our panel, but you're more than welcome to stay afterward and ask more questions if you'd like. We're gonna send out an email with some feedback and some resources. And if you want to chat one-on-one with the panelists and you just really enjoyed what they had to say or you have more questions, please email us. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, panelists, for your time and talking about your identities. We really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Yeah.